I always thought family was sacred, something unshakable, unbreakable. But when my father died, I learned the hard way that greed doesn't care about blood ties. People you've trusted your entire life can turn into predators the second they see an opportunity. And the worst part? It's always someone you never thought capable of betrayal. It started the day after my father's funeral. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. My mom and I were in the kitchen, trying to find some semblance of normalcy as we brewed coffee and picked at leftover sandwiches neighbors had brought over. She looked fragile, like a strong wind might blow her away. My father had been her whole world for 30 years, and now, she didn't know how to function without him. We barely had time to sip our coffee when we heard the doorbell. I opened it to find Uncle Rick standing on our porch, holding a thick stack of papers and flanked by a stranger in a suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Uncle Rick wasn't your average uncle. Growing up, he'd been the fun one, the guy who'd sneak me candy when my parents weren't looking or let me stay up late during sleepovers at his house. He had this charisma, this easy charm that made everyone around him feel like they were his favorite person. But as I stood there looking at him, something about his smile felt off. Forced, maybe. "Alex, sweetheart," he said, pulling me into an awkward hug. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I said stiffly, stepping back. He didn't wait for an invitation before strolling into the house. The man in the suit followed, clutching a briefcase like it held state secrets. My mom appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of exhaustion. "Rick," she said weakly. "What's going on?" "Judy, you look terrible," Rick said, completely ignoring her question. "I came to help. We've got a lot to sort out, and I figured you'd need someone with experience to take the reins." "What are you talking about?" she asked, confused. Rick sighed dramatically, like he'd been burdened with a task he didn't really want but was too noble to refuse. "The estate, Judy. Tom's assets, the house, the insurance. All of it. It's a lot for someone in your condition to handle. Lucky for you, Tom asked me to step in and take care of everything." My mom blinked, looking completely blindsided. "He never mentioned that to me." Rick chuckled, the sound grating against my nerves. "You know how Tom was. Always trying to keep you from worrying. He probably didn't want to overwhelm you. But don't worry, I've got it all under control." That's when he pulled out the papers. "These are just standard documents," he said, sliding them onto the kitchen table. "Power of attorney, a few transfers, that sort of thing. If you sign these, I can start managing everything for you. It'll make things a lot easier." My mom stared at the papers like they might bite her. I don't know, Rick. This feels so sudden." He smiled again, that same forced, saccharine grin. "Come on, Judy. Do you really want to deal with all the bank accounts, the property taxes, the lawyers? Let me handle it. It's what Tom would have wanted." Something about the whole situation made my skin crawl. My dad was meticulous. He planned everything down to the smallest detail. There was no way he would have made this kind of arrangement without telling my mom, or me. "What's in the documents, exactly?" I asked, stepping closer to the table. Rick's smile faltered for just a second, so quickly I almost missed it. "Like I said, sweetheart, just some legal stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." "I'd like to see them," I said, reaching for the papers. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the stack for a fraction of a second too long. "Sure," he said finally, sliding them toward me. I didn't know much about legal jargon, but even a quick skim was enough to raise every red flag imaginable. The documents didn't just give Rick the power to help us, they gave him full control over my dad's estate. The house, the bank accounts, the life insurance policy, everything. If my mom signed, Rick could do whatever he wanted with it all, no questions asked. "This seems extreme," I said carefully, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. Rick laughed, but it was hollow. It's standard, Alex. You wouldn't understand, it's complicated legal stuff. Trust me, it's for the best. I think we need more time, I said firmly, handing the papers back. Rick's smile vanished completely, replaced by a tight, almost threatening expression. Time isn't on your side, Alex. These things need to be handled quickly. If you don't act soon, you could lose a lot more than you realize. Is that a threat? I shot back, my heart pounding. He raised his hands in mock surrender. Of course not. I'm just saying you don't want to drag this out. It's in everyone's best interest to get this settled as soon as possible. My mom, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly spoke up. I need to think about this, Rick. I can't make a decision right now. Rick sighed again, clearly annoyed. Fine. Take a day or two. But don't wait too long, Judy. This is a delicate situation. With that, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, the man in the suit trailing behind him. As soon as the door closed, my mom collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. What's happening, Alex? She whispered. Why would Tom ask Rick to do this? I knelt beside her, my own frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Mom, I don't think Dad asked Rick to do anything. This doesn't feel right. She looked at me, her eyes red and glassy. What do we do? We get help, I said firmly. That night, I stayed up late, poring over the documents again. The more I read, the angrier I got. Rick wasn't just trying to help us, he was trying to take everything. He must have thought we'd be too grief-stricken to notice or question him. Well, he was wrong. The next morning, I called my dad's lawyer, Ms. Grant. I didn't know her well, but I remembered her from the time she'd come over to discuss my dad's business. She was sharp and no-nonsense, the kind of person who didn't take crap from anyone. When I explained the situation, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, Alex, I need you to bring those documents to my office. Immediately. I could tell from her tone that something was seriously wrong. When I arrived at her office, she skimmed through the papers with an intensity that made me nervous. Finally, she set them down and looked at me. These are not standard documents, she said. If your mom had signed these, your uncle would have complete control over everything. He could sell your house, drain your bank accounts, and there wouldn't be a thing you could do about it. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Can he do that? Legally? If you'd signed? Yes. But the fact that he even brought these to you in the first place is suspicious. I think there's more going on here than you realize. She hesitated, then added, I need to tell you something else. Your uncle contacted me about a month ago. He wanted me to rewrite your father's will. My stomach flipped. What? He said your father had changed his mind about how he wanted the estate divided. But I refused. It didn't sit right with me, and your father never mentioned anything about it directly. Now I see why Rick was so insistent. I clenched my fists, rage bubbling in my chest. So, what do we do? Ms. Grant leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. First, we make sure your uncle can't touch a dime of your father's money. Then, we start digging. If Rick's been pulling strings behind the scenes, we're going to find out. For the first time since my dad's death, I felt a flicker of hope. Rick thought he could take advantage of us, but he underestimated one thing: I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations, strategy, and simmering anger. Rick thought he could swoop in and rob us blind while we were still drowning in grief, but he didn't count on one thing: I wasn't about to roll over and let him. I was going to fight back, and I was going to make him regret ever underestimating me. Ms. Grant wasted no time putting up defenses. First, she filed an emergency injunction to freeze all of my father's assets until the court could sort everything out. This meant Rick couldn't access a penny of the estate, no matter how hard he tried to maneuver. It was the legal equivalent of slamming the door in his face, and I couldn't wait to see his reaction when he realized his plan had hit a wall. But that wasn't enough for me. I didn't just want to stop Rick, I wanted to understand how deep his betrayal went. I wanted to know if this was just a moment of opportunism or if he'd been plotting this for longer than I realized. The first piece of the puzzle came just a few days later. Ms. Grant called me into her office with a grim expression on her face. "Alex, I've been digging into some of your father's records. There's something you need to see." She handed me a stack of printed emails, and as I scanned the pages, my stomach twisted into knots. They were correspondence between Rick and Ms. Grant, at least, attempts at correspondence. In one email dated just a week before my father's death, Rick had written, "I'm telling you, Tom wanted this change. He doesn't have much time left, and we need to act quickly. Just rewrite the will and send it over for his signature. I'll handle the rest." Another email, sent a few days later, was even more brazen. "If you're refusing to cooperate, I'll find someone else who will. This is what Tom wanted, and it's not your place to question it. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ms. Grant had, of course, refused to comply. But the emails painted a clear picture. Rick had been scheming long before my dad even passed away. He hadn't just seized an opportunity, he'd been creating one. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My father had been in and out of the hospital for months before he passed. He'd trusted Rick, relied on him to help keep things running smoothly while he was too weak to manage everything himself. And Rick had used that trust as a weapon. I clenched the papers in my hands, my vision blurring with a mix of rage and disbelief. How could he do this? I whispered. Ms. Grant gave me a sympathetic look. "Unfortunately, Alex, money has a way of bringing out the worst in people. I've seen it happen before." Her words only fueled my determination. Rick wasn't just going to get away with this. I was going to make sure of it. The next step in my plan was to get closer to Rick without tipping him off that I was onto him. If he'd been reckless enough to leave an email trail, chances were he'd slip up again. And if he did, I'd be ready. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Rick called my mom a few days after the injunction was filed, his tone dripping with fake concern. "Judy, I just heard about the freeze on Tom's accounts. Is everything okay?" My mom, still reeling from everything, didn't have the energy to argue with him. "Rick, I can't deal with this right now. You'll have to talk to Alex." That was all the invitation he needed. Less than an hour later, he showed up at our house, unannounced and uninvited. "Alex," he said, his tone overly cheerful as he stepped into the living room. "I was hoping we could have a little chat." I forced a smile, even as my fists clenched behind my back. "Sure, Uncle Rick. What's on your mind?" He wasted no time getting to the point. "Look, sweetheart, I know things have been tense lately. I hate that. We're family, and I just want to help you and your mom through this tough time." "Help us how?" I asked, tilting my head innocently. "Well," he said, shifting uncomfortably, "this whole freeze on the estate, it's unnecessary. It's only going to complicate things for you and Judy. If we can work together, I'm sure we can resolve everything much more quickly." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from snapping at him. Instead, I played along. "What do you mean by work together?" Rick leaned in, lowering his voice like we were co-conspirators. "If you convince your mom to lift the injunction, I'll make sure everything is taken care of. You won't have to worry about a thing. I'll even set aside a little extra for you, call it a thank you for making this process easier." The audacity of his offer made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's really generous of you," I said. "But I don't think Mom's ready to make any big decisions yet. She's still grieving, you know." Rick's smile tightened. Of course, of course. But just remember, Alex, time is money. The longer this drags on, the less there'll be for you and Judy in the end. It was a thinly veiled threat, and it told me everything I needed to know. Rick wasn't just desperate, he was running out of time. After he left, I decided it was time to take things up a notch. I started recording every conversation I had with Rick, just in case he let something slip. I also planted a small voice recorder in the living room, hidden in a bookshelf where I knew he wouldn't notice it. It didn't take long for my efforts to pay off. A few days later, Rick came over again, this time with his son, Tyler. Tyler was everything you'd expect from someone raised by Rick, entitled, arrogant, and completely oblivious to how the world actually worked. He'd always been the type to coast through life on charm and luck, but lately, it seemed like his luck was running out. I pretended to leave the room, but I stayed within earshot, listening as Rick and Tyler spoke in hushed tones. "You've got to move faster, Dad," Tyler hissed. "I'm already 3 months behind on payments, and those guys aren't going to wait much longer." "I'm doing everything I can," Rick snapped. "But Judy and Alex are being stubborn. They're making this a lot harder than it needs to be." "Well, figure it out," Tyler said, his voice rising. "I'm not about to lose everything because you can't handle one grieving widow and her bratty kid." My hands clenched into fists as I listened. Tyler was in trouble, big trouble. And Rick was trying to raid my father's estate to bail him out. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Rick wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Armed with this new information, I went back to Ms. Grant. She was impressed with the recordings I'd managed to gather, but she also warned me to be careful. "Desperate people can also be dangerous," she said. "Don't let him know you're onto him until we're ready to make our move." I nodded, determined not to let my emotions get the better of me. This wasn't just about protecting my dad's legacy anymore, it was about justice. Rick thought he could manipulate us, intimidate us, and steal from us without consequence. He was wrong. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. Rick wasn't just greedy, he was ruthless, willing to exploit my father's death and our grief to fund his son's shady debts. But anger wasn't enough. I needed a plan, something that would expose Rick for what he was and stop him from ever pulling something like this again. While Ms. Grant worked on the legal side, I took matters into my own hands. If Rick and Tyler were desperate enough to talk openly in my living room, then they were bound to make more mistakes. I just had to keep watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The first break came unexpectedly. I'd been doing some research on Tyler, combing through social media and local forums to see if I could find any clues about who he owed money to. What I discovered was worse than I expected. Tyler had been banned from 2 local casinos for causing a disturbance. According to a post in a gambling forum, he had a reputation for running up massive debts and refusing to pay. The comments painted a vivid picture. "Tyler R. is a scammer. Owes me $10,000 from last year, still hasn't paid. Dude's a clown. Got kicked out of Golden Palm last month for trying to use a fake cashier's check to cover his bets. If you see him at your table, just walk away. He's trouble." It didn't take long to connect the dots. Tyler wasn't just in debt, he was in deep with the kind of people you don't cross. And Rick wasn't trying to steal my father's estate just for the money, he was trying to save his son from a problem that could spiral out of control. Armed with this information, I decided to set a trap. Rick came over again a few days later, his usual fake concern plastered across his face. This time, he brought more papers, claiming they were updates to the original documents he tried to push on us. I pretended to humor him, taking the stack and flipping through it as though I didn't already know what he was up to. "Thanks for bringing these by," I said, my voice as neutral as I could manage. "I'll take a closer look later." Rick gave me a tight smile. "Good. The sooner we get this resolved, the better for everyone." As soon as he left, I scanned the documents and sent them to Ms. Grant. She called me an hour later, her voice practically shaking with anger. "These aren't updates, Alex. They're worse. He's trying to sneak in a clause that would let him liquidate the estate without your or your mother's approval. If she signed this, you'd lose everything overnight." I wasn't surprised, but the sheer audacity of it still made my blood boil. Rick wasn't even trying to hide his intentions anymore. He was banking on us being too distracted, too overwhelmed, to notice what he was doing. But I noticed. And now, it was time to put my plan into action. The first part of the plan involved Tyler. I figured he was the weak link in Rick's scheme, the one most likely to crack under pressure. And thanks to the gambling forum, I had a good idea of how to rattle him. I created a fake email account and reached out to one of Tyler's creditors, posing as an anonymous tipster. In the email, I wrote, "If you're looking for Tyler R., try checking his dad's house. Rumor has it they're sitting on a fat inheritance and trying to liquidate it ASAP. Might be worth a visit." It didn't take long for the results to roll in. 2 days later, Rick showed up at our house looking more stressed than I'd ever seen him. He was sweating, his tie loosened, and his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something closer to desperation. "Alex," he said, his voice tight. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, leaning casually against the doorway. "What's wrong, Uncle Rick? You don't look so good." He ignored the jab and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Have you told anyone about the estate? Anyone outside the family?" I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "No." "Why?" Rick ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "Never mind. Just, don't mention anything to anyone, okay? This is a private matter, and we don't need outsiders sticking their noses where they don't belong." "Sure, Uncle Rick," I said, fighting to keep the smugness out of my voice. As soon as he left, I called Ms. Grant to update her. "He's panicking," I said. "Something spooked him." "Good," she replied. "That means we're getting close. Keep pushing." The next part of the plan was riskier, but I knew it was the only way to get the evidence I needed. I decided to confront Tyler directly. I found him at a local bar a few nights later, nursing a whiskey and looking every bit the picture of a man in over his head. I slid onto the stool next to him, and he looked up, startled. "Alex? What are you doing here?" "Just wanted to talk," I said, signaling the bartender for a drink. "You've been spending a lot of time at our house lately. Figured we should get to know each other better." Tyler laughed nervously, his eyes darting around the room. "Yeah, well, Dad's been helping you guys out. Family stuff, you know." "Uh-huh," I said, taking a sip of my drink. "Must be stressful, though. I mean, with everything else you've got going on." His face froze for a split second before he forced a grin. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know," I said casually. "The debts. The guys looking for their money. Stuff like that." Tyler's grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. "Who told you that? Does it matter?" I asked, leaning in closer. "What matters is that I know. And if I know, what's stopping me from telling everyone else? Including those guys you owe." He swallowed hard, his hands gripping his glass like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You wouldn't do that. Wouldn't I?" I asked, my voice cold. "You and your dad tried to screw us over. Why shouldn't I return the favor?" For a moment, I thought he might explode. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shaky breath. "Fine," he muttered. "What do you want?" "Everything," I said. "I want to know exactly what you and Rick have been up to, and I want proof. If you give me that, maybe I'll forget what I know about your extracurricular activities." Tyler hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door like he was considering making a run for it. But in the end, he cracked. Okay, he said finally. I'll tell you everything. Just, don't say anything to those guys. Please. I nodded, my heart pounding. I'd won this round, but I knew the game wasn't over yet. When Tyler started talking, it was like the floodgates opened. He told me everything, how Rick had started plotting as soon as my dad got sick, how they'd been hoping to use the inheritance to cover Tyler's debts, and how Rick had planned to make it all look legitimate by manipulating my mom into signing away her rights. But the best part? Tyler had proof. Emails, text messages, even a recording of Rick outlining the plan in detail. He handed it all over, desperate to save his own skin. When I walked out of that bar, I felt a surge of triumph. Rick thought he could outsmart me, but he didn't realize he was up against someone just as stubborn, and just as ruthless, as he was. Now, I had everything I needed to bring him down. I spent the next few days organizing the evidence Tyler had given me. Emails, texts, voice recordings, it was all there, laid out like a detailed blueprint of Rick's betrayal. It was damning, undeniable, and enough to bury him. But as satisfying as it was to have all this ammunition, I knew that simply taking it to the authorities wasn't enough. Rick had spent years building his reputation as the charming, dependable older brother, the golden child of the family. He wasn't just stealing money, he'd built a lifetime of lies that everyone in our extended family believed without question. If I was going to take him down, I needed to destroy not just his plan, but his carefully crafted image. I called Ms. Grant, who was thrilled with the mountain of evidence I'd collected. "This will hold up in court, Alex," she said. "If we file this, Rick won't just lose access to the estate, he could face serious legal consequences. Fraud, forgery, and possibly even conspiracy." But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted the world to know exactly who Rick was and what he'd done. The perfect opportunity presented itself when Rick decided to throw a family dinner. It was a tribute to my dad, or so he claimed. In reality, it was a chance for him to get everyone on his side. He'd been working overtime to spin a narrative, framing himself as the selfless uncle who'd stepped in to help us while we floundered in grief. When my mom got the invitation, she was hesitant to go. "I don't want to be around him, Alex," she said, her voice shaky. "Not after everything he's done." "I know," I said, gently squeezing her hand. "But trust me, we need to be there. It's time to show everyone the truth." She gave me a wary look but eventually agreed. The night of the dinner, Rick was in full form. He worked the room like a seasoned politician, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, and making sure to tell anyone who'd listen about all the help he'd been giving us. "It's been a tough time for Judy and Alex," he said to one group of relatives, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "But family sticks together. That's what Tom would have wanted, you know. I'm just doing my part to make sure his legacy is protected." I almost choked on my drink, but I stayed quiet, waiting for the right moment. As dinner was served, Rick stood at the head of the table, raising his glass in a dramatic toast. "To Tom," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "He was a great man, and it's an honor to carry on his legacy by taking care of his family." I exchanged a glance with my mom, who looked like she was on the verge of tears, not from sadness, but from sheer rage. I gave her a reassuring nod before standing up. "That's a lovely sentiment, Uncle Rick," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to silence the room. "But let's talk about what taking care of the family really means to you." Rick froze, his smile faltering. "What do you mean, Alex?" I walked to the head of the table, pulling a small USB drive from my pocket. "I've been doing some digging," I said, my voice steady. "And I found a few things you forgot to mention." The room was dead silent as I plugged the USB into a laptop I'd brought with me. Within seconds, the TV on the wall lit up, displaying the first email Tyler had sent me. "If we can get Judy to sign, we'll have access to everything. She's too distraught to notice, so we just need to act fast." Gasps rippled through the room as I flipped to the next piece of evidence, a recording of Rick talking to Tyler. "Don't worry about it. Once I've got power of attorney, I'll sell the house, cash out the accounts, and pay off your debts. Judy and Alex won't even know what hit them." Rick's face turned bright red as the recording played. He started stammering, trying to come up with an excuse, but I wasn't done yet. "Oh, and this is my favorite," I said, clicking on another file. It was a video clip of Tyler sitting in that bar, confessing everything. "Yeah, it was Dad's idea. He said we could take control of the estate and use it to cover my debts. I didn't even want to do it, but he said it was the only way." By the time the clip ended, the room was in chaos. Aunts and uncles were shouting over each other, demanding answers. Rick's carefully constructed facade had shattered in an instant. "This isn't true," Rick bellowed, his voice cracking. "It's all fake. Alex is just trying to." "It's over, Rick," I said, cutting him off. "We've already filed everything with the court. The estate is frozen, and the judge will be hearing the case next week. You're done." Rick's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But before he could say anything, Tyler, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, clearly hoping to go unnoticed, stood up. "Dad, stop," he said, his voice shaky. "It's true. It's all true. We tried to take the money, and we got caught." The room erupted again, but this time, it was clear that everyone was turning on Rick. His own son had just sold him out in front of the entire family. The fallout was swift and brutal. Rick was completely ostracized. No one in the family wanted anything to do with him after that night. Tyler, desperate to save his own skin, cut ties with his father and even agreed to testify against him in court. The judge ruled in our favor, ensuring that my mom and I retained full control of my dad's estate. Rick, on the other hand, was slapped with multiple fraud charges and forced to pay back every penny of legal fees we'd incurred. He lost his house, his savings, and, most importantly, the respect of the family he'd spent years manipulating. But the most unexpected twist came a few weeks later. While cleaning out some of my dad's old files, I found a handwritten letter addressed to me. It was dated just a month before he passed away. "Alex," it read, "if you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I've always trusted Rick, but lately, I've noticed things that don't sit right with me. If he ever tries to take advantage of you or your mom, don't be afraid to fight back. You're stronger than you think, and I know you'll do the right thing." Tears streamed down my face as I read the letter. My dad had seen this coming, and in his own way, he prepared me for it. In the end, Rick tried to steal everything, but all he accomplished was destroying himself. And as for me, I finally felt at peace, knowing I'd protected my family, and honored my dad's legacy in the process.